Yo, what's going on guys? HyperX here. Welcome back to another video for Elden Ring, and today I want to do a follow-up video to the double whip build. Some of you guys might remember we put together a video the other day showing the Castlevania build, the double whip build, running both Hoslow's Petal Whip and the Thorn Whip, set up with Occult affinity to take full advantage of the Arcane scaling, and of course with that it also has blood loss on it, so it is a very potent high damage combo. A lot of you guys really enjoyed it, a lot of you guys said you will be testing it out or are already running whip combos. And more importantly, some of you guys also had some additional suggestions, things that we should try, things that we could alter to basically tweak the build. So what I thought would be fun to do today is to pick out a few comments and basically implement some of your suggestions and test them in real time. We're going to test out things like cold affinity, poison affinity, alternate whip suggestions, alternate strategies, basically just try and answer some questions, plus some of you guys want to know a little bit more about occult and bleed scaling, so I will try and do my very best to explain it in greater detail. So if you guys do enjoy this, a like would be super appreciated. Comment down below if since then you have used this build or you've been using a variation of it, how are you getting on with it, are you using it in PvE, PvP? I want to know all of this stuff. And of course don't forget to subscribe if you guys are enjoying the Elden Ring content. So very quickly, before we dive into the sort of suggestions, things like that, as a quick recap, of course, if you want to watch the full in-depth video, which has all the locations for the items and of course has all the build details, I will link it down below. But as a quick recap, I was running two whips. I was running the Thorn Whip, which of course is one you get from a random drop. I like this one, it's red, your boy likes red, it looks hella cool, and of course it is a nice potent weapon. And the other one was Hoslow's Petal Whip, which of course is one you get from doing the Volcano Manor questline. There is of course a second option, and I'll speak about that later in this video. So of course we had those two, both of which of course have natural blood loss build-up, so you do have some nice damage, and you do have some nice blood loss opportunity. Keep in mind wielding two whips allows us to use the Power Stance combo, which is also incredibly potent. However, for this one specifically, both of the whips were switched over to Occult affinity, and of course with Occult it takes your scaling from Arcane, so you have some very nice high damage potential and also still high blood loss buildup. Of course, with that in mind, the build also runs the White Mask to take full advantage of the bleed procs. We also have the Raptor's Black Feathers armor piece, which of course gives you an increase to jump attacks. We have the Lord of Blood's Exaltation Talisman, which stacks with the White Mask, alongside the Winged Sword Insignia and the Claw Talisman for increased jump attack damage and successive attacks, and of course with your fourth free slot. So that was basically the setup. We also ran with a seal just so that we could use Flame Grant Me Strength for an additional boost, and altogether this was very potent. It already does a fantastic amount of damage. We rinsed through a ton of bosses. It is lethal, but there are always ways you can change things, tweak things, so let's refer to some of your suggestions. One of the first comments came from Christoph. He said you can also roll with a keen Urumi Whip and get S tier scaling in Dex. I switched to a Belmont build when Arcane scaling got fixed to mix things up, using Hoslow's and Urumi to get solid damage and bleeds, but if I am facing something that doesn't bleed, I dual wield keen Urumi Whips. He also said, PSA for the new love towards whips, if you get invaded by a Belmont, they fall apart against aggressive flanking due to the extended animation times when attacking. Hey, don't tell him our secrets, yo, you're giving it away. He also said, I think a cool series would be if you actually go and try and sort of counter some of these powerful weapon builds during invasions to sort of help out the balance. I'm sorry, but let me just tell you right now, hey, I love the suggestion, but your boy does not PvP. I'll tell you, the only time I PvP is when I go and try and trade items with 2-6 and somebody invades to try and steal the item and I have to defend my honor and defend the item. Listen, right, that's the only time I PvP. I like PvE. Anyway, that aside, it is a cool idea. Maybe something we can revisit at some point in the future. But the Urumi Whip is a fantastic item. In fact, it's a weapon that I used in my Dex video. It's one of the ones that I said is one of the best Dex weapons because, as you mentioned, it does of course go to S tier scaling. It is a very nice weapon. If you guys haven't caught our Dex video, you can find out where to get it in that video. And it is also worth mentioning, it is the only whip, to my knowledge, that is a slashing type whip. All other whips tend to be strike type damage, which of course is still fantastic. It's still a great damage type. But if you do want a slashing type weapon, then the Urumi Whip is a fantastic choice. It of course does have the sort of one downside that it doesn't come with, native blood loss, which isn't necessarily a must. I mean, you are of course not necessarily always going to use this for blood loss builds. It's just a fantastic weapon, and it is worth noting in this particular demonstration, I am not perfectly spec'd for this. I am of course much more heavily spec'd into Arcane. My dex stat is on the lower side, so if I really wanted to get mileage out of this one, of course I would lean more heavily into dex. But you are right, this is a fantastic whip. If you guys are looking for something purely on a damage point of view, you're not leaning into, say, the affinity side of things, then grabbing one of these, or grabbing two of these, then of course running with these, and of course switching it over to Keen to get that dex scaling in S, is fantastic dex damage potential. Moving on from there, we then got a comment from Big Mac 1625, who said, for those who have already killed Rykard and can't do the Volcano Manor quest, there is an alternate method to get Hoslow's Petal Whip. If you follow the Jarbo quest to the very end, you can get one from that as well. And yes, that is true. I actually went through and did that one, finally. We did put up a video the other day on the channel on how to complete the Jarbo quest line. I do, however, want to follow up and say that if it doesn't necessarily work like it did in that video, because it was actually slightly different for me, Paradise Central went through and did that tutorial. And for him, of course, you go over and you will find the guy you need to speak to in Volcano Manor, and then you sort of go back and follow the steps for the quest. For me, it didn't work out that way, so basically, if that doesn't work, stay in Jarbo Village, and then of course continue to speak to the pot. And anytime you sort of have exhausted the dialogue, simply reload the area and continue with that process. At one point, I actually had to switch time of day to night to then sort of move things along. But yes, if you do go and complete the Jarbo questline, eventually you will then get the second Hoslow's Petal Whip, which I have now done, now fully upgraded. So I now have some alternate options. Which then of course ties nicely into Pedro Villar's comment. He said, I run the exact same build for about a week, but I would personally recommend running one of them with cold. The dex strength stays the same, but you do get a ton of frost. This build works for me because I'm dumping stats on every skill, so that may not be for everyone. So yes, that is of course true. I actually went and did that same thing. Again, of course, my dex is not as high, so maybe I wouldn't necessarily have the same damage output as Pedro in this situation. However, I will say, I really like that one. I really enjoyed it. I kept one of the whips still on Occult so I could lead into the damage boost from Arcane while still maintaining the blood loss, which of course is fantastic. But the cold is very nice because of course cold behaves in a very similar manner to bleed initially, in that of course once it procs you do get the big chunk of health taken off, but following that the enemy of course then takes more damage. So the fact that you of course have the ability to bleed and inflict frostbite means you have two potential options for proccing those big chunks of damage. But also you have the weakness that is applied when Frostbite is active, so really this does actually make for a very potent combo, and I'm actually enjoying this one almost a lot more, because Double Bleed, don't get me wrong, is fantastic, but actually mixing things up and having more affinities, more sort of debuffs, is a lot of fun. So yes, switching one to cold is quite nice. In fact, what I've been doing is running 3 whips, basically, so that I can then switch between the ones that I like. Additionally, linking into this, a comment from Chris Bebu said that I actually run a similar build, except I use 3 whips, so I cycle out Raptors of the Mist and Bloodhound Step. Also consider putting Poison on one. It can also help with a slow stick in PvP, and you can run the talisman that boosts attack power whenever an enemy is poisoned or rotting, which of course is also a very nice suggestion, because much like cold, poison is of course a nice affinity as well. Obviously behavior is slightly different, but I did then go and test out this one. I also like this one a lot. I do really like the idea, of course, of having Raptor of the Mist on an alternate whip, because I mentioned in my original video, I really like that Ash of War. I probably use Bloodhound Step a little bit more just for the movement, but I love the behavior of Raptor of the Mist. It kind of just reminds me of like a substitution in Naruto, only you don't teleport into a log, you just teleport into feathers, but also the fact that it actually puts you up into the sky, puts you in prime position for jump attacks, so it's actually a fantastic skill to use with this build, just because every time you get that dodge, you are then in prime position to get the boost from damage because you are jumping. So that is also very nice. But of course, Poison, again, a very nice affinity to use. I hadn't really sort of thought about it from a PvP point of view, because again, largely speaking, I am in PvE, so I'm kind of running a lot more sort of a unga bunga, basically just rush the enemy and try and kill them as quickly as possible. But you are right that of course having Poison for those slow ticks over time is also very nice. And that talisman you spoke about, of course, is this one. This is basically like the Poison version of the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, only this one is the one for Poison. So of course, if you do have both of them, then when you've bled the enemy and you've poisoned them, you have those double damage attack boosts, which again is very nice. Now this next comment from Magalas, of course, we won't necessarily go into the build in the conventional sense, but I did want to entertain it because it is actually a really cool weapon. The Fire Giant Whip, he said, is also nice with this just because of its Ash of War, which is like the one from the Netflix series itself, but it's mainly scaled on strength. Admittedly, I am not really spec for this one. In fact, I actually had to put on a different helmet, and I had to activate a Great Rune just to meet the faith requirement for this weapon. Of course, ordinarily I would respec, but it is also a very nice weapon. Like, I like the look of it, and I do like the Ash of War. I actually like the behavior and the fact that the final attack actually trips up the enemy, which of course is very nice. But of course, you do also have that slightly slow wind up, so I feel like if I was using this efficiently for sort of the whip damage and just like the fast-paced combos, I feel like I wouldn't necessarily use the Ash of War as much, but I do really just like how it looks. I like the behavior. It's a lot of fun to mess around with, and of course, if you are more strength spec'd, then of course maybe that could be an option for you. And then finally, comment from We Are Legion said, so Arcane does improve blood loss build-up, question mark. I've looked up everything and I get mixed answers. So I'll try and do my best to sort of explain this, because yes, there are sort of mixed responses. The way that I understand it, of course, is that, as mentioned, if we talk about it purely on an occult basis, first things first, if you do go and pump points into Arcane, then when you select Occult affinity, of course, you will actually gain a lot of physical damage boosts from Occult. If you actually take a look at the numbers, you'll actually see that in this situation, having Occult gives me by far the highest damage on the whip, and I also still maintain a lot of the blood loss buildup. However, specifically around Arcane and blood loss, increasing Arcane appears to improve the blood loss buildup rate, in that of course if you have higher Arcane, you will of course have higher blood loss buildup, meaning you can get those procs more quickly. The actual bleed damage itself is typically a percentage of the enemy's health, so to my understanding, please correct me in the comments if you know any differently, but the blood loss damage itself is typically percentage based on the health, so of course pumping into Arcane is not going to necessarily change that damage, but you can of course increase the blood loss build-up, meaning you can actually proc that more quickly. I have heard people talking about the fact that of course increasing Arcane can potentially increase the first blood loss damage tick, but I haven't been able to confirm that myself, so as it currently stands, as I currently understand it, basically the method here of course is pumping into Arcane to increase the frequency or the speed in which you can actually proc bleed, and again, therefore if you lean more so into Occult, you still get to maintain bleed, still get to get fast bleed procs, but you could also benefit more from of course the physical damage as well, so you basically get 2 birds, 1 stone. You get damage and you get bleed. So that is basically why in the previous build I went Occult over native bleed. So there you have it. There's a little rundown on some of the follow-up things from the build video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully it's answered some of your questions, and hopefully you enjoyed the fact that we sort of tested out some of your suggestions as well. If you guys would like to see more things like this in the future, definitely let us know. If you missed our recent upload, be sure to check out this one, and keep it locked on the channel for plenty more Elden Ring.